America is in a state of revolution. It's not the kind of revolution with competing armies or a coup d'etat. It's an invisible revolution along the axes of race, gender, and identity, and it's shaking our country down to the foundations. In order to understand America's Cultural Revolution, it's important that we go back to the origin point, the year 1968. This was an era of incredible turmoil in the United States and around the world. And when you go back into that time and you look at the documents, you read the books, you understand the news reporting, you can see very clearly that the Marxist left-wing intellectuals in the West were really at a self-described dilemma or impasse. They believed that the revolution in many ways had failed. It failed in the Soviet Union, which after World War II, everyone acknowledged had descended into bureaucratic tyranny with gulags and extreme methods of suppression and not even providing basic sustenance for its population. But more importantly, it also had failed in the countries of the West. When they looked to Europe and especially the United States, the Marxist intellectuals thought that the working class, in which Karl Marx had invested all of his hopes as the revolutionary proletariat, had actually transformed culturally and become not just non-revolutionary, but in fact anti-revolutionary. People in the United States that were in the middle and working classes were largely satisfied with a rapidly rising standard of living, with a level of material comfort that had been unknown in all of human history to the common citizen. And so rather than give up on Marxist theory, the intellectuals at the time, predominantly the intellectuals who were known as the critical theorists, developed an alternative strategy to implement their revolutionary ideology. And so what we have is someone kind of most prominently at the University of California, San Diego, a philosopher named Herbert Marcuse, who had immigrated from Germany after Hitler had taken power and had really been working with his colleagues to develop these new critical theories, sometimes called neo-Marxist theories. And a critical theory, very simply, is a theory in contrast to the traditional theories, which sought to explain the world, which sought to reveal human nature, which sought to uncover these eternal principles. A critical theory, on the other hand, was a theory that sought to expose and undermine and demythologize existing social institutions to then convert or transform them towards the complete liberation of human potential, the complete liberation of society. And so these critical theories, and most specifically coming from Herbert Marcuse, became really the dominant philosophy of left-wing ideology and left-wing politics of that era. Students in 1968 were marching through the streets in European capitals, unfurling banners that read, Marx, Mao, Marcuse, meaning Karl Marx, the kind of touchstone creator of Marxism as a economic and political theory, Chairman Mao Zedong, who brought kind of Marxist-Leninist revolution to the country of China in 1949, and then this elderly German intellectual, Herbert Marcuse, who promised to bring the principles of Marxism to the current era. And so Marcuse believed, that they could create a new proletariat, not based on the working classes, not based on seizing control of factories and other means of economic production, but a two-part proletariat that brought together those kind of white student radicals that fermented the universities around that time, and then the black urban underclass that had been rioting against, in many cases, abominable social conditions in American ghettos. And Marcuse believed they could unite these two disparate and in some ways contradictory elements, the white intelligentsia and the black urban population, to become a new proletariat that could advance a program of cultural change and cultural subversion that would eventually weaken those structures of society that prevented the true rupture, the true kind of socialist rupture. And Marcuse made this very clear. He wrote about how to enact this cultural revolution, and he wrote that it would assume the character of, quote, preparing the grounds for the coming socialist revolution. And so the goal, always the same, that Marxist socialist revolution Although the methods in the 1968 revolution started to shift, they were starting to find a way of bringing this about in a non-traditional or non-orthodox way. And so when you bring those principles together, the philosophy of the critical theories, the new two-part proletarian, and the program of cultural revolution, you get this extremely powerful expression that began within the explosive year of 1968 and has traveled now more than a half century to a position where it's gained dominance in elite American institutions, starting in academia and now going into other elements of the American bureaucracy. It's potentially a world historical change. It started in 1968, and it's now at the forefront of our society. These theories have now spawned their own subdisciplines, which have become dominant in American intellectual life. The best example, perhaps, is critical race theory, which takes that basic Marxian concept of class conflict and transposes it onto the axis of race. The critical race theorists have argued since the late 1980s, when their discipline formed, that the American society is fundamentally and irredeemably racist, and that all of our American institutions, from the Constitution to the Bill of Rights, to the Civil Rights Act, to freedom of speech, to our culture and economic system, preach the values of liberty and equality. But when you rip away the mask, when you understand what's really happening beneath the surface, they're mechanisms of maintaining white supremacy and racial domination. This ideology, which began in elite law schools like Harvard Law School in the late 1980s, has now been perpetuated through almost every bureaucracy in our country. First, according to the critical race theorists themselves, they've published this in interviews and articles and journal publications. The critical race theorists colonized the education system. First and foremost, the teacher training programs in graduate schools of education. They moved to the other disciplines like sociology and anthropology and public health and other places in the universities, until finally in the last decade or 2 decades, starting to become solidified in the administration of universities as so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion. From there, it went to the K through 12 education system. You see very clearly that the principles of critical race theory, most notably systemic racism, white supremacy, white privilege, whiteness, abolition, have become dominant, especially in left-wing K through 12 education systems in places like Portland and Seattle and New York and Chicago, where they've been adapted into specific K through 12 pedagogies. And then you see it really moving even into Fortune 500 companies as part of diversity and inclusion projects, as part of diversity training programs, to the point where you see Fortune 500 diversity trainings, K through 12 pedagogies, and then kind of pure critical race theory in law schools, trafficking in the same core set of concepts and ideas. If you're wondering, as you're going to work, as you're looking in your child's backpack with the lessons that are coming home from school, as you're reading the headlines in the newspaper, where are all these ideas coming from? Why is it that it seems that they've achieved dominance? It's because the critical theorists, specifically the critical race theorists, have adopted that Gramscian war of position, using their status, prestige, and power within elite institutions to try to promote these ideas more broadly in American society. And on that case, it's been a stunning success. And it seems like that march through the institutions, which was first proposed in 1968, has achieved a position of dominance, has achieved that stunning success that they outlined in their hope and ambitions, starting in 68, continuing to 1987, and now achieving what is very close to hegemony or intellectual dominance within the institutions today. In conditions of cultural revolution, the only proportionate and intelligent response is to mount a counter-revolution. This has been true for the last 150 years, from Karl Marx to the Russian revolutionaries of 1917 to the critical theorists of the 1960s. The greatest fear, that line that runs through all of their thinking, is a fear of the restoration of the regime's values, the fear that the middle will revolt against their elite institutions and reimpose the previous order. And so I'd propose that the ambition of our movement, the ambition for not only conservatives, but people in that broad middle, people who are represented by the common citizen, is to mount a strategy of counter-revolution that strikes at the heart of the program of the critical theorists. This will require a really three-step program. First, it requires tapping into that deep sentiment that's held by the common citizen, that senses that something is happening with our institutions that is wrong, that when they see that homework coming back and it's critical race theory, or they go to work and they're being shamed for their race or gender, that somehow this is not just a one-off problem, but it's intelligible as a political phenomenon that can be opposed on substantive and political grounds. Second, we have to develop a language. We have to develop a language that busts through the euphemisms like diversity, equity, and inclusion and gets to the real truth of the matter. For example, that critical race theory is being dominant in our institutions. And also develop a language that can arm the common citizen with a method of speaking back, with the method of speaking successfully against this ideology that is being imposed from above. And third, we have to mobilize a democratic coalition to oppose the critical theories where they exist, which is in our public institutions. The conflict today is not the conflict that was predicted by the critical theorists between the intelligentsia and the non-revolutionary working classes, or between the racial categories of whiteness and blackness. The conflict today, and how we have to conceptualize this fight of counter-revolution, is that this is an elite revolution that seeks to use public institutions at the highest level to impose a new set of values against the common citizen, against the common people. And so therefore, the political coalition that must emerge is a political coalition of the common citizens in revolt against the elite institutions. And we can leverage our democratic power through school boards, through state assemblies and state senates, and ultimately through the federal deliberative bodies in Congress, in order to advance a policy program to strike back against the critical theories. And while it sometimes seems that these theories have generated absolute control over all of our knowledge-making institutions, that they've become the common language, the common conceptual reference for all of our political discussions, there is a key vulnerability. There is an Achilles heel. It's that the critical theories, since the beginning, are a creature of the state. They've been totally subsidized by public institutions and public dollars, and they can only survive within the publicly funded bureaucracies. And so, as a force representing the majority of the American people, finding our power within the democratic institutions of the legislature, we can sever that connection. We can separate the critical ideologies from the bureaucratic power centers, because the public institutions ultimately must reflect the will of the public, they must reflect the values of the public, and they must serve the public good. And so this counter-revolution can start to identify where the critical theories have power, in those bureaucracies that are insulated from the market, that are insulated from citizen oversight, that are insulated from direct control, and then start to change the laws and policies to strip funding from the critical theories, to strip power from the critical theories, and to start reorienting our public institutions towards serving the common citizen.